Well, welcome everybody to our program on addiction and recovery from the Sunshine Coast Health Center up here in Powell River, BC. And we'll be talking about cravings. Maybe not all that exciting, but cravings have created a great controversy recently. They've just been put back into what's known as the DSM-5. It's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, 5th edition. And they've included cravings as one of the ways to diagnose an addiction, one of the criteria that psychiatrists or psychologists would use to diagnose an addiction. And a lot of people are quite upset about this. Because one of the reasons they're so upset is because they would make an argument that, maybe cravings shouldn't be part of how we diagnose addiction. But the people who put it in there obviously think, well, they should be. That's why they put it in there, right? So anyway, there's a hot debate going on with the inclusion of cravings in the diagnostic criteria for, who has an addiction, who doesn't. Anyway, I thought we'd give you some insight into this and just maybe go over some of the more famous ideas on craving. So I've been reading up a bit on the scholarly research literature on this stuff, and it's kind of interesting. In the old days, and I'm thinking about like 200 years ago, they were quite convinced that cravings were like a real part of the addiction, and this is like almost a defining piece. And even 100 years ago, a very famous fellow by the name of Norman Kerr, he wrote several pieces on this idea that cravings and drug use were almost, synonymous, right? That cravings were an integral part of why alcoholics used alcohol. So it was kind of interesting. Nowadays, this idea has come back with the inclusion of cravings in the DSM-5. So that's kind of interesting. So we've gone gone full circle here. And just to give you some idea of the controversy, though, if you pour through the research literature, there are a lot of people who aren't as enthusiastic as some of the people who would like to see cravings in there. So if you go through the literature, it's kind of interesting. I've just got some articles here, right? And we've got some people who think that, yes, there is a brain chemistry component to cravings. That's true. But they say, well, really that's not enough. Beyond this physical component, there's a motivational component. And the motivational component is actually the thing that leads to the drug use. So that's interesting. Eh? So we do have the biological part of craving, which is basically when the addict doesn't have drugs or is interrupted from when they're planned to use drugs, then they get these really bad cravings. So the physical part, which I think most people agree with, but also there's this motivational part, this psychological component. So that's kind of interesting. And some other researchers figured out that yes, cravings have this physical thing, but really what the person is doing is they're feeling this thing going on inside them. They don't really know what it is, and then they try to make sense of it. And the way they make sense of it is, oh, I guess I really want to use drugs. So that's kind of interesting. So that's another bit of a wrinkle on how to interpret cravings. Some people actually think they're just like psychological, and that it has to do with really how much, for example, anxiety someone might have, or how much depression they may have, that kind of thing. And other people think that, there's no real thing called this craving thing. In fact, craving, you can have like little cravings and giant cravings, right? And somewhere along the line, and maybe it's only the giant cravings that actually lead to the drug use, not the little cravings, right? So all of these different ideas that are floating around in the literature now. And so a lot of people have concluded that, well, maybe we really don't understand what cravings is. And some of the most fascinating research is that we now know that a lot of people use drugs even if they don't have cravings. So that's kind of interesting too, eh? And this is empirical research too, by the way. And then on the other hand, we have lots of what we call anecdotal evidence from addicts themselves and said, oh, geez, I got this really wicked craving. I just had to use a drug. So, geez, how do you make sense of all this stuff, right? So all these different ideas going around, all these research experiments being done. So at any rate, we'll see if we can give you some insight in that. And along the way, maybe give you a few clues on how, if you are experiencing cravings, how you can deal with them. At any rate, we'll be back next time and pursue this idea.